It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna...
Well, hello and welcome again to Islands at War with myself, Keith Vangeli, and...
Nick Lahire. Morning, Keith.
Morning, Nick. So we are embarking now on an episode per week. That's our self-imposed schedule in order to have Christmas 2025.
Yeah, instead of having Christmas in the middle of a summer and me not feeling very Christmassy.
Well, likewise. Okay, so we got a heck of a lot to do in June 1943. There's some dark stuff in here, so as you suggested, Nick, we'll go with some lighter items. We're going to start off in Sark. So we've got a couple of people that are curfew breakers, and they decide to blame the church clock.
Yeah, they do. This is Mr. and Mrs. Lanyon, the Sark baker, and his foremost shopkeeper in Sark, was found out in the streets with his wife a little after curfew in Sark. Now, to be honest, they weren't the only ones that almost got caught out by this in Sark, because I found another article in the newspaper after I'd sent you the script for today when I was at the Prio Library yesterday, and I was just looking through for something I'd taken a note of. And the Sark Chief Police was meeting a week before this, and they were meeting in the evening. So for anybody that doesn't know, the Sark Chief Police is part of their sort of government function in Sark. I'll put some notes to explain exactly what it is in the show notes. But they'd been meeting, so they'd been debating government matters, etc. And then the clerk mentioned that it was 10 to 10 and they were going to be a bit late. So they all stood up and were about to leave, and then conducted the last bit of business, which was to insist that anybody, and this would have affected this gentleman, anyone selling bread had to weigh it in front of the customer, otherwise they would be fined £2. But they passed that one as they were leaving the building.
Yeah, because they couldn't rely on the time. So everybody was going by the clock.
Yeah, so, well, I presume they must have had a watch or a clock in Chief Police. But this chap, Mr. Lanyon, he said, well, the reason I've been caught out after curfew was I'm relying on Sark church clock, which says it's only 9:58.
Do we know if they were caught by one of the German personnel, or were they caught by the Seneschal, who was their only policeman?
I have no idea. I would imagine it was probably by a German, and then they referred to the civil courts, because although it was a breach of a German law, a German order, effectively.
Well, the law in Sark is slightly different anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You still ended up in a civil court, effectively. So they got to find £1 each.
Yeah. I mean, for those of you not really sure about Sark, it is one of the smaller Channel Islands, and its government, almost to this day, is a mixture of Mervyn-Pink, Gorman, Gast, and the Shire in Lord of the Rings, but in a good way, Nick, because I know you're friendly with the senior. Moving back to Guernsey, this is a bridge party. A businessman's wife was making some cake with some flour she saved, but there was a mix-up the flour got mixed up with something else.
Yeah, it seems like they had a successful party with their friends there. She'd baked some cakes, she'd saved some flour. Unfortunately, after the guests left, her husband asked for his slug powder, and she said, well, you know, what slug powder? And he said, oh, it's up there on that shelf. Yeah, you can imagine what happened. So it's a bit of a panic. She rang all the guests, and they all said they'd really enjoyed the cakes and no ill effects. So they all laughed about it afterwards, except one hypochondriac guest she chose not to inform. And strangely enough, that person, despite suffering many, many ills, did not report the fact that she'd been unwell after eating the slug powder cake.
So no one admitted to being a bit sluggish after. Boom, boom.
I didn't think
you could always edit that out.
I didn't think about that one. God.
Okay, again, in Guernsey, we have some new films arriving for the Guernsey public. You've got quite a bit on this. And can I just throw this question in at the time? Did this also apply to Jersey?
I would imagine that these would have been swapped over with Jersey, because that happened quite a lot. Now, you can imagine there's a bit of a shortage of English language films. So predominantly what happens is they're showing whatever films they had here at the cinemas, basically in stock at the time that the Germans arrived. 1940, you're going to get a bit bored of those. And of course, the other stuff is all German propaganda films or German films, which are not, some of them are, the ones that I've seen are just awfully dull. With obviously they had subtitles, etc. on those. And now this is towards the end of June, and the headline in the second page of the paper, because we know the first page is reserved for propaganda. The headline in the second page is "New films arrive for Guernsey public. Sarnians will visit CI camp in Germany." Now, visit CI camp in Germany is a little bit of from what I can gather from the various sources that I've looked at, to go near the camp. They're not showing a movie of what's going on in the camp. Now, the Germans do have quite a bit that they get published in the paper about the camp and about, everybody's having a lovely time, all that malarkey. What does make me laugh is that people will know it, where this camp is by now. But when they're reporting it in the press, they're only, for Laufen, for example, they're only allowed to put L and a load of underlining as the name of the camp. I don't know if it's because the Germans are worried that the British might get their hands on a Guernsey press like they did during the commando raids or that sort of thing. Anyway.
I think it's a case of, if we can be secretive, we'll be secretive. Right. It's ingrained, isn't it?
Because not long after this, they get 18 photographs of people in the camps, group photos, which they publish over a number of editions of the Guernsey Press. Anyway, back to the film. So if you've listened to earlier episodes, you'll have heard us talk about Sonderführer Guitmann, who was the censor. Now, he was a big fan of all things British, and he seems to have secured some films while he was away in Germany. He'd been to France and onwards to Germany. And I looked at this and went, new films? Well, actually, they're not that new. Basically, they're films that had been obtained before the US entered the war. So some of them will be new to Islanders, but not particularly. But there's a lovely big puff piece about his personal endeavours on behalf of Guernsey cinema. Sonderführer Guitmann was thanked for his continual personal interest in providing us with an evening's entertainment. Clearly, this can be written by the Germans. The Guernsey press is not going to have written something quite so flattering as this, or if they have, it's been heavily edited, probably by Sonderführer Guitmann, who actually was quite liked by various people. He used to censor all the shows that were being done, because as we've talked about before, there was a lot of amateur dramatics.
So he would, even with the small, I say regional, the parochial players that were playing around, he would get involved in any sort of public show, just run his eye over the script and that.
Yeah, you'd had to look at the script before it was allowed to go ahead. So, and there were various accounts of because he went to university in England just before the war, and he was, very much interested in English culture, the arts, etc. And quite often it would appear that people took their scripts to him and for the plays and things, and they'd end up discussing. He'd sort of flick through it and end up discussing other matters, other bits of the arts and things like that, and comparing German arts to English. So I don't think he paid too much attention. He's not much longer for the Channel Islands, but we'll get to that in a couple of episodes' time. Although a bit like Arnie, I'll be back. So they didn't mind him too much. In fact, I know in Frank Farr's book, he talks about the fact that it's a bit of a pain in the neck when Guitmann's away on holiday, because his sort of junior censor or stand-in censor
was a bit more applied.
Was a bit more keen on being thorough and making sure things happened. So they were quite sad when he left, and there was a bit of a puff piece. But so these films they had 16 English and American films, and it says, as I say, new, but they're new to the Channel Islands. They were called things like They Wanted to Marry, If This Isn't Love, The Big Game, Bluegrass, Fit for a King. I must admit, none of these must have been particularly big hits.
No, but we're in a different world now, and I think if you could go somewhere and escape just the hunger pangs, people are going to go.
Yeah,
aren't they?
absolutely. I looked some of them up. The only one that actually seems to have been particularly massively popular at the time seems to have been The Three Musketeers.
Yeah, well, okay, film of a classic book.
And of course, the Germans had seating. Again, we'll come to it later on. I've found some very odd correspondence regarding seating for the Germans in the cinemas, but they had reserved seating areas, not only in the Germans would sit one side and everybody else would have to buy tickets for the other side, but down to reservation of seats for certain people and things like that. It's all very complicated because, of course, we had a lot of cinemas in the Channel Islands then.
Indeed, we did.
Not so many now.
No. Okay, well, we're going to move over now to Jersey. We know, Nick, that around about the time of 42, there were deportations from Jersey. There was some, what has been, I think, accepted as rioting. We move into June 43, and there's a concern on behalf of the field commandant in Jersey about Jersey U's gathering. Sounds like the Birds or something.
Yeah, this is a note from Colonel Nakfus, who's in charge of the Feld Kommandantur in Jersey, well, for the Channel Islands, but he's based in Jersey. And Nakfus has written to the Constable of St. Juan, care of the Bailiff of Jersey, and says it's been established that in the evenings and also on Sunday afternoons, congregations of young people gather at St. Juan's Parish Hall and pass remarks of disapproval with regard to the passers-by and also against members of the German forces. I request that you take effective measures to put a stop to this, as otherwise I shall be obliged to take action. Now, I'm guessing, and this is pure guesswork by me, but if he's saying and also against members of the German force, I'm guessing this is probably against the other passers-by, are probably women that are going out with German soldiers, I guess.
Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah, and he's writing to the parish authorities here, isn't he? As opposed to, although he is copying in the bailiff. So,
care of the bailiff. But.
Yeah. Okay. Does that escalate at all? Do we know if this is a sort of just one-off thing and everybody listened to what was said and that was it?
I didn't find anything else on that. So there are various bits at various times. I think that there are, and we've touched on this before, because there are more, shall we say, youths, people who were of school age and then have grown up slightly during the course of the occupations, late teens and whatever. There's perhaps a bit more activity like this in Jersey and a bit more dissension.
It's human nature, isn't it? Okay, now we're island hopping again. We're back in Guernsey, and we're slightly surprised, Nick. I think both of us that younger members of the community were quite what we say up on the movements of the ebb and flow of the black market here. You've got this enterprising child. This is quite a story, isn't it?
Well, it was enough of a story that it made the Guernsey press during the occupation. The story was in June, and it's somebody reporting that they were walking through St. Peter Port recently, and one of our staff was somebody from the Guernsey press stopped by a small boy, not more than 6 years of age. Now, I mean, these days you'd be wondering what the heck he was doing out on his own, who demanded quite casually, although he was approaching a stranger, that the latter should lend him sixpence for some sweets. So the member of staff said there aren't any sweets to be had, and the enterprising youngster had his response ready for that one. Said, "I know where I can get some," and then said, "I can get them on the black market." It's a 6-year-old saying that.
It's a bit Dickensian.
It did make me laugh.
Gangs of children sort of accosting.
It doesn't say if he gave them the sixpence.
No. Okay. Right. Now, again, staying in Guernsey, the United Club was raided. What was the United?
It's still there. The United Club is a club, a private members club. It's near Boots, for those of you who know Guernsey. It's on off of Pier Steps there. They got raided, and I'm frankly amazed that it took until 3 years into the war before they got raided, because they have rather a nice view of the harbour from there. In fact, you can see I've got some photographs taken from there, which I will put on our social media. But you can see all the way round to basically round towards the Salary, all the way to Havelet, etc.
So you've got a sweep up and down the channel between St. Peter Port and the other islands, really.
Yeah, and the reason I'm surprised they haven't been raided and caught for this before is I can't believe that it's taken 3 years before somebody's picked up the pair of binoculars that's kept there and used them, and that it's taken the Germans 3 years to spot this, because the Germans were next door in the Ship and Crown. What was the Crown Hotel there? That was the harbour master was based in there, and various other Germans. What happened was, in June 1943, the club was raided, and a set of field glasses, binoculars to you and me, and a steward were taken away. And later on that day, it was heard that Mr. Russell, who was H.M. Greffier, and a member of the club, has been put in prison. Now, bearing in mind, this is a fairly senior official in the...
Senior clerk to the court, something like that.
Yeah, effectively clerk of the court, clerk to the government. He's been locked up because of this. And it was because suspicions have been raised because members used field glasses at the window overlooking the harbour.
Overlooking German positions, effectively.
Overlooking German positions and the harbour, what shipping was coming and going. In fact, it was a week ago today, I was holding on to what we think were those very binoculars and having a look out the window. I've taken some photographs, and I will stick them on our socials. Also, if you look in the show notes, there'll be a link to a page which has got these on. So Ambrose Robin notes on the 4th of June, so a couple of days later, the club steward had been released, and although Alf Russell and other club members were questioned, there turned out there wasn't any prohibition order for not being allowed to use binoculars. They slipped up there, didn't they? I mean, you're not allowed to use a camera outdoors and not allowed to sketch outdoors, but they forgot about binoculars.
Oh, and there's the thing about telescopes. You could use a telescope, though, because there was no prohibitive order.
Well, no, I think they're interchanging telescopes and binoculars here. So there was no order basically saying that you can't do that. So I've got a picture of said binoculars. They are looking a bit battered these days. I imagine that
they're still there. Then
they're still there. They're on a bookshelf. Yeah. I've got a picture of the outside of the club building and just some of the views from there as well. But it's a very nice club. Right, onwards.
Yes,
we've got a lot to get through.
Luxury shops.
Yeah,
talk to us about so-called luxury shops.
Well, this time it's Dr. Casper from the Feldkommandant who's writing to the bailiff of Jersey, saying, given the number of inhabitants in the Channel Islands at present considered fewer than before the war, bearing in mind in Jersey it's not that many fewer, about 5,000 fewer than there had been, so not a massive amount. About 10% of their population had gone, and about half the population in Guernsey. But this is Jersey specific, although it does make it over to Guernsey. This letter he's saying there's no tourist traffic. Really? This is a surprise. I wonder why there's no tourists. Anyway, he's writing saying basically we've got a lot of shops that sell luxury items. I don't think that's the case by 19...
No,
we're 3 years in. I suppose it depends what your definition of luxury is. There is some talk about people getting annoyed because they consider strawberries to be a luxury because the prices of them are so high. But he's talking about these luxury shops and furniture shops, etc. Quite why he picks on furniture shops, I really don't know. But he says they're hardly necessary. And he says, I want inquiries to find out how many are there and what we're doing about them. So the bailiff then gets hold of the Chamber of Commerce in Jersey and gets information off of them. They write back and they say, quite rightly, the majority of shops actually have got a reduction of staff already taken place, and they're running on as few staff as possible, and because quite a few left. By the way, you've deported some of our other staff, etc., etc. And, they quite rightly write back to the bailiff and say, with regard to luxury shops, it is difficult to define exactly what these are, even under present conditions. As long as the shop is supplying those with a definite demand for commodities which the public still regards as necessary, even under war conditions, I don't think they're luxuries. It can be classified as a luxury shop. So, from this point of view, the number of luxury shops is negligible. Now, this was all down to, you're probably wondering what this was. I don't know why they decided to pick on luxury shops, but they were looking for labour. That's what they were looking for. And we'll come to it later on in this episode about why I think it's a little bit harsh about what's happening in the labour front.
Okay, so we'll move back to that. So essentially, were they combing the shops for shop assistants that had very little to do?
Yeah, they were after staff.
Yeah, so really
they wanted excuses to close down shops.
Yeah.
We'll come to that in a wee while.
Okay. Jewellery, diamonds, and more. The Germans force entry into safe deposit boxes?
So the whole idea was, for those people that were still in the islands, you'd receive a letter from your bank, which I've got an example here which says, "Dear Sir or Madam, from the Westminster Bank Limited in Jersey, the German Field Commandant has informed me they're attending this bank on Monday next, the 7th of June, to examine boxes, parcels and envelopes in custody here. They will attend from 9 a.m. to 12 noon and from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. All packages, etc. will be opened in the presence of witnesses. You are invited to attend this inspection, bringing any necessary keys. In your absence, the package will be opened." Signed off by the bank manager. Now, various other of our diarists, etc., also note on this. Louis Guillemot talks about it happening in Guernsey, but basically what they're doing is they're trying to find out what gold, jewellery, etc., foreign currency, anything of value, what's there. Now, Louis raises this because the Germans are obviously operating on a tight schedule, because if they're at a Westminster Bank in Jersey on the 7th of June, they're planning on being in Guernsey on the 8th of June. And the 7th was a Sunday, so it's slightly confusing. But in Guernsey, after the Jersey visit, all the local bank managers were summoned to Grange Lodge, so that's the Feldkommandantur, for a meeting with the German from Paris. Now, the Germans had basically a team of people going around just doing this all over the occupied territories. And they very grandly named it the German Foreign Currency Control Board. And they demanded to know what was in the strong boxes in the banks. They didn't ask anybody from the controlling committee to attend this talk. And so Louis went up to Grange Lodge and had a bit of a go at Major Kratzer.
Yes, because essentially they've invited no one from the state to be present and pressured the bank managers themselves to be present at this meeting.
Yeah, they did. The bank managers had to go. They had no choice. So Kratzer apologised to Louis for not inviting somebody from the controlling committee to the Monday meeting. And his excuse was, it's very short notice. Louis pressed him to find out exactly what's going on. And he said, well, as far as he knew, the idea was to obtain information concerning securities, gold bullion and uncut diamonds in the island. So Louis's next question was, well, what are you going to do with them when you found them? Are you going to remove them? And he said, well, I don't know anything about that. I don't think so.
Yeah, it was against the Hague Convention to remove anything that was owned by private persons, wasn't it?
Yeah, you can happily steal, take.
Which they did.
Which they did from any government assets, but you're not allowed to take anything else. Louis Guillemot reminded him that under the Hague rules that was the case, and the Kratzer says that it was conducted under a law made for the whole of Germany as well as the occupied territories, because the Hague Convention talks about that if the law applies in the occupier state, then you're fine, basically. And he said if the German government wished, they could make a law that everybody must wear a top hat, which Louis thought was a bit of a ridiculous analogy. And Louis goes on to say, well, do you overrule the Hague rules then? And Kratzer said, well, we can do what we like, provided such laws are applied in Germany as well as the occupied territories. Louis basically told him, you're having a laugh, mate. But it seemed to have been a fairly well received point that you shouldn't really be doing this.
what spun out of it in the end then? Presumably they did open these boxes, did they?
Well, so if you didn't attend in person because, I don't know, you'd been evacuated or you'd been deported.
Good point. So they're going to open boxes that may have been left behind by people that had evacuated.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
So basically they broke into them. If you didn't turn up with the keys, they broke into them. And they were looking for, they gave a list to the bailiff of Jersey. Because for some reason in Jersey, they gave them far more information than appears to have been given here. I don't know if they just took it. It may well be that the Germans coming from Paris didn't understand how the whole thing worked and that we were separate, etc. But they gave them a list and said, look, what we're looking for is foreign currency, foreign means and means of payment with the exception of Reichsmarks, French francs, Belgian francs, Dutch guilders, zloty, Danish crowns, Norwegian crowns and crowns of the protectorates of Bohemia and Moravia. So why they're exempting all those, I don't know. And they were after English pounds, gold in the form of ingots, nuggets and scrap and gold coins of all descriptions, diamonds, foreign bonds. What they're going to do with foreign bonds, who knows? And credit accounts with other institutions, with banks abroad, except German and European French. And any claims against persons resident abroad, except in Germany or European. So it's just very, very, very odd. I mean, some of the bank managers certainly here were very smug because they'd taken precautions right back at the start of the occupation or just before and, shall we say, stored them in some other places.
Yeah.
Or sent stuff off island when people were being evacuated to some safe custody boxes, etc., were sent off. So the Germans didn't get quite what I thought, but I mean there were some things that were missing, like regimental silver and bits and pieces like that did go missing. Some of it which was recovered after the war. But yeah, they were just going to break into your if you weren't here or you didn't turn up, they just broke into your box.
Okay, during these episodes, right from the beginning of this podcast series, we have mentioned the subject of food, or more pertinently, the lack of it. We're now halfway through 1943. Nick, it continues to be an overwhelming theme, doesn't it? And Reverend Ord here talks about the market queues and the food shortages, but how it really, really is starting to bite into the psyche almost of people here, the frustration of queuing, not being able to obtain anything, even though they stood in queues, of the physical aspect of having to stand there for possibly, hours, quite possibly. You've got some really heart-rendering examples here.
Yeah, I mean, Ord we know is well connected. And Ord said he's had some very difficult conversations with people. He talks about the chap who was the fish controller had reported to him heart-rending scenes in market queues. Now, bearing in mind, you're the fish controller in charge of basically the rationing of fish, and you're seeing what I'm about to describe. How's it going to make you feel? He said people have tramped miles. People are standing in queues until they faint. Many of them are waiting only to get to the front of the queue and then find that they're turned away empty-handed because they've just run out of fish to sell them, and he says that he describes tears of misery and anger, and very old people and those in ill health are patiently waiting for fish. The fish controller says, look, I'm trying to be as fair as possible, but there's just not enough food. And, to reinforce this, Ord's getting a telephone call that a relative is thought to be dying on her feet and often found to be faint. The doctors, the Guernsey doctors, that is, not the German one, are saying drugs are useless. Food alone is needed, but cannot be obtained. And basically, only German officers of a high rank are getting enough food by this point. And Ord's wife summed up the situation. The elderly cannot obtain extras for age or sickness, and so there's nothing really to help. I mean, there is extra rations of full cream milk for children, but that's about it. But people are postponing having operations because they've got no provisions to build them back up afterwards if they need to Also, if other visible effects are described, swollen feet and legs, there's nothing that the doctors can do. The vicious cutting of the bread ration has particularly impacted people, along with stopping the meat ration. I mean, in June, they end up with 4 meatless weeks from what I can get. And there's no sugar to be had, so that's making things worse. People are worn down to skeletons and tightly drawn over facial bones. And this is 1943 we're talking about here.
There's still some way to go.
There's a hell of a long way to go. We've got the whole of 1940 to go through with all that entails. And Louis talks about mothers on cycles, cycling with small children strapped papoose-like on luggage carriers padded against inclement June weather going off to go and get their shopping. It's a little bit like all those bikes you see riding around now, the cargo bikes. Perhaps we were a little bit ahead of our time there. But he said every time that they were eating a meal, well, the subject in question was, well, what are we having next?
Yeah. I mean, my grandmother, I've said before, grandfather was away in the war, and my grandmother was trying to bring up my father and my aunt as small children. 43, my father would have been 9, and my aunt would have been something like 6. And how she managed, plus the fact that she had herself, her mother, and her father-in-law to look after, how she managed to keep people going is quite unbelievable.
It's just incredible. And Louis Gilman makes a very fair point here. He says, planning meals is like a jigsaw with missing or wrong pieces after the 3 years. There's no more broccoli to be had. Had beans once, he notes in his diary. Have tomatoes, but no lettuce. Bread ration strained. Breakfast is 1 slice of bread each. And he talks about even relatively simple things, pancakes. You need sugar and flour, neither which are easy to obtain. Roast potatoes require an oven, and they don't have any gas for the oven because they're really restricted on what they can use that for. And you can't pop to a hotel or a restaurant for odd meals.
Yeah, lest we forget. And as we just said, 2 years to go. Moving away from food, robberies were rife on the island, and they're continuing. Tell us a little bit about that, Nick.
Well, this is kind of food related. I mean, this is the thing. A lot of the crime that is happening is either people being caught out after curfew, without their identity cards or things like that, or it's food related. And there's been a fresh outbreak of robberies. Thieves stole some hens. But this one's particularly odd because they actually cut off the heads of the hens and left them on the owner's doorstep at the place where they stole them from. And they took 15 chickens and 2 rabbits at one place. You've got a baker being fined for being £600 short of flour in 6 months. And he said, well, basically, I couldn't see people starving, so I gave extra flour out of kindness. And I took the risk out of humanity. And he's getting prosecuted for it. This is up against an order that the Germans published saying that the German army had secured the current supplies of foodstuffs and all necessities of life for the civil population. But the reality is very, very, very different to that.
Yeah, well, again, food and robberies are going to go hand in hand throughout the next 2 years of occupation. Of course, cutting the heads off the chickens means that the chickens will go quietly. Trying to run away with several chickens is going to be a bit noisy, so the poor things would have been dispatched there and then. Brutal times. Press reporting, June 1943. You've spotted, I'm very impressed that you spotted this, your juxtaposition. First time we've used the word in the programme, probably the last time. Tell us about this, because we've got some really interesting insight here into 2 press pieces that have been printed and published next to one another. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so basically, as you can imagine, with all the problems of getting supplies, etc., then there are issues around meat. There are issues around bread. The Germans have cut the rations. A lot of the correspondence in the paper is to do with food, or the control of rationing, control of prices, that sort of stuff. Now, I think in the 4th of June 1943 Guernsey Press, I think the editor has been particularly clever here, because there is a letter to the editor, which I would hazard a guess was written by the Germans, which basically says, is headlined, "Patience, all will come right." Yeah, right. And it basically, paraphrasing it, it's like, what's all the fuss about? Everything's fair. We don't need subsidies. We don't need to increase the rations, blah, de blah. Everybody, we should be fine if they're just careful with things and whatever. And then stuck right next to that is reporting the sad death of a St. Saviour's constable who died while fetching his rations. And basically it's because of the condition that he was in. That they're quite lucky that they got away with publishing that, to be fair. It's clearly because they're allowing people to write in with pen names. So Sarnian is the imaginative pen name of the person supposedly he wrote in.
So do you think that
saying everything was okay?
These are not letters they've received. These are plants written by the editorial staff.
They might have delivered it in the form of a letter saying, "Here's a letter from. It's been written by the church." Sure, they'll have made sure that that's published. Now, so I think that's just some very clever placing of those two.
Yeah, well, I was impressed that you spotted that. I wouldn't have picked that up. Issues around the Red Cross here, and again regarding rations. And there was is this a slowdown in the delivery of Red Cross messages, etc.?
Well, now you remember if you listened to the May 1943 episode, there was all this fuss about the fact that the controlling committee here and the Superior Council in Jersey were writing to the International Red Cross as the protecting power regarding the reduction of rations by the Germans. The Germans weren't very happy about it. They didn't like the content. Kratzer, at this point, Louis Guillemot's not giving up on this. He goes to the Feldkommandantur and he's talking to Kratzer and he says, "What's going on? We've got a problem here. We've not been receiving Red Cross messages. So does that mean our letter hasn't got there? Or, how are things going? Has it gone?" Because they'd written to Berlin as well, to the Swiss ambassador in Berlin. "What's happening with our letters?" And he's like, "Oh, it'll be on its way, et cetera, et cetera." And, and then diverts the conversation to the fact that there's going to be some cattle on the way. But, yes, so there's some doubt about quite whether these letters are going anywhere. And it turns out later on that the Germans held on to them for quite a while because they were thinking that the Germans here thought the rationing cuts might be temporary. So they held on to them. Now, the Archbishop of York gets involved in this. Now, I'm guessing you're thinking, how on earth did the Archbishop of York got involved in this when it's very difficult to get a message in or out of the islands? Well, Mrs. Sherwell had received a letter from Ambrose Sherwell, her husband, who, of course, had been deported by the Germans. She hadn't been deported. And because you could write a little bit easier between the camps in Germany and here, and equally the camps in Germany and to the UK and the wider world, he had the current Archbishop of York at the time had formerly been the Bishop of Winchester, and we fall under the. I'm probably going to get this wrong, and several people I know might tell me off, but I'll do my best to explain this. My understanding was we're part of the Diocese of Winchester. We fall under that, and so the Bishop of Winchester, or we certainly used to, the Bishop of Winchester was therefore well known locally. Would have been in the Channel Islands quite a bit, and so in his capacity of Archbishop of York, he'd written to Sherwell. Presumably Sherwell had written to him first, and Sherwell had written back to him, stressing the island's need for Red Cross aid, and asked the Archbishop to use all personal influence that he could to obtain it. Sherwell had also written to the headquarters of the Red Cross, primarily in Geneva, on behalf of all of the islands. But the Germans get wind of this because Sherwell is also meeting with the Red Cross when they come to the camps, and the Germans get wind of the fact that he's basically he's only supposed to be talking to the Red Cross or corresponding with the Red Cross about the conditions of islanders in the camps, and the Germans ban him from. Well, it's in July, so I think he gets away with it for a couple of months, but then they ban him from mentioning all matters other than in the camps. And he writes to his wife and tells her that. But like I say, I think that's July.
Okay, over in Jersey, Nick, the Germans are there's a lot of German activity in terms of exercise and alarms, and our friend Mr. Lesotho in Jersey has written an account of this.
Yeah, Lesotho talks about invasion mania. A state of high alert and invasion mania persists amongst the German troops. Now, you remember from the May 1943 episode, we talked about that. They were getting up to all sorts of things, and he says that there have been multiple anti-invasion exercises and alarms, and on around the 10th of June, there had been significant activity. Then there was another panic on the evening of the 11th of June. All the German personnel were called from cinemas and cafes to battle stations. And then another further little panic had happened on the evening of 5th of June. And Lesotho hopes these frequent false alarms are a sign that there's going to be a real invasion of the Channel Islands to take them back. And that he's hoping that all these false alarms are going to make the Germans very complacent and it won't be too much of a problem. But he also talks about he's noticed there's been a thinning out of troops with departures significantly outnumbering arrivals in recent weeks, and it's just part of the coming and goings.
Yeah, but if it's noticeable that more were leaving than coming in, I mean, was this right? I mean, June 40, the Russian front was pretty. Were they starting to retreat from the Russian front?
Yeah, they were still shipping people off to the Russian front, etc.
Because Nick, generally speaking, when you look at the way that the tide eventually started to turn, 1943 was quite pivotal, wasn't it? I mean, it was. We'll see later on in the year, people from the Channel Islands being contacted in the UK. We'll get onto that. So there was a sense that things had, whilst people weren't hopeful in the sense they were still experiencing these awful deprivations with food, etc. But I think there was a feeling that the Germans were sort of on the back foot, even locally. This sort of diary entry backs this up.
Yeah, and the diarists are talking about the fact that there are Germans openly talking about the fact they just wish it was all over, and they don't care who wins. But I think the troop movements are difficult for them to be certain on. It's just what they're observing and what other people have told them. There was a bit of a rescue operation in Jersey as well. A German flying boat rescued a British pilot who'd been adrift in a rubber dinghy for several days near the Paternosters Reef as well, which I can't find any more on that, to be honest.
Okay, so this
one other thing that I forgot to mention, actually, which was back when we were talking about the rationing, was rather harshly, and again, bearing in mind that fact, people, some people are dying on their feet and really suffering to get food, etc. They basically impose a rule the Germans impose an order which says you've got to work a minimum of 48-hour week or up to 60 in special circumstances. So that's not going to help, is it?
No. Okay, so here, Nick, elderly fisherman, Mr. Quinnan, he's a person from Alderney, living in Guernsey, fishing out of St. Peter Port, and their boat was had the misfortune, obviously, to strike a mine. What's the sort of backstory here? Because it was quite a tragedy, to say the least.
Yeah, two Guernsey fishermen were killed. They're described as Guernsey fishermen when they basically, it would appear, pulled up in their nets a mine and it exploded. So Herbert Dunn, who was 21 years old of the Grand Buyet, was, it says, not seen again, and Archibald Sabir, aged 28, of Upland Road, was drowned. Now, the Quinnan brothers, John and Harry, survived the tragedy. And it was awful. I mean, Dunn was the sole support for his widowed mother, who was a semi-invalid for a number of years. This was absolutely awful, and the Germans tried to spin it. It would seem not in the newspapers, but as they were wont to do, putting information around in rumours and things like that. That actually the mine had been laid by the British.
Yeah.
By a ship that had been in the area. This was awful. The Quinnans obviously lost their boat. They were in a pretty bad way, but they'd done all that they could to help Sabir, who found some wood and clung to it. But unfortunately, that was all. It was all too much, and unfortunately, he died. The nearest other fishing boat was 5 minutes away, but even in that 5 minutes, it was just too late for them. So yeah, and it turns out they'd been lifelong friends. So a fund gets started in order to do this, and we'll see how that develops over June and July. But the Germans get a bit fed up of these sort of collections going on, right? And they basically come the third week of June are basically saying any sort of collections for charities or any sort of other appeals are admirable. You're going to need a permit, and you have to give written notice a week in advance, etc., to the Feldkommandant. 10 days in advance to the Feldkommandant, telling them basically why you're doing the collection, what's it for, how long is it going to go on, where and when, and what the form of it is. And so they're basically telling the bailiff of Jersey and his pass a law to do that, and I want to see a draft of it within a week as the Feldkommandant. So yeah, the only thing that does get exempted is church collections. So if it's a collection in church, that was exempted.
Okay, we move on from charity collections in Jersey to the sinking of M483 Minesweeper. So this is quite an incident, so packed with action. So if you could guide us through this, that would be great. This is a really quite interesting piece.
Yeah, so our friends from 263 Squadron, we've talked about quite a lot over the last few episodes with their Whirlwinds and Whirly bombers, along with Spitfires from various other squadrons, predominantly 616 and 505. Now, they were undertaking what were known as roadstead operations. So that was basically looking for shipping. And in the middle of June, they had, this is quite a force of aircraft to be out looking for shipping. They've got 8 Spitfires from 616, 8 from 504 Squadron, plus all the Whirly bombers and Whirlwinds that are, being flown with the view to attacking. Because, of course, the Whirly bombers drop, does what it says on the tin. They can drop bombs, but they're also armed with 20mm cannon as well. So they're going to really ruin your day. So they got a few miles northeast of Sark, where they found a convoy which involved minesweepers and various other shipping there to defend them. They attacked them and managed to sink one of them. They had a few problems. So a minesweeper was sunk. A Spitfire was set on by some of the flak from the warships. They was described as intense and accurate. And yeah, unfortunately, one of the aircraft exploded in flames just over the top of the ship, probably hit by a 40mm shell from another of the ships that was defending them, which was probably a small destroyer, we think. But unfortunately, the pilot, quite understandably, didn't survive, given that his aircraft exploded. Some other aircraft suffered a little bit of damage, but they made it all back. Now, you were asking me about RAF operations around here in June, and they weren't quite so active because 263 had actually moved to a different base for a little bit of sort of R&R, that type of thing, and were but whilst they were still active down here, they weren't as active as they had been earlier. But that changes again in July.
Okay, now we move on to the notion or the subject of propaganda here. Ord writes about a couple of things. I think we touched on this before about the Germans had commandeered some land here for their cemetery. Is this set at Cherbourg?
Well, we couldn't work out exactly where it was, but
no.
We think it was potentially Cherbourg. Yeah.
And also, Ord notes Dr. Goebbels' propaganda on the horseshoes with zips. What's that?
Yeah, Ord's very amused by this because there's an article reproduced in the Guernsey Press, I think it was, or in the Star, one of the two, which Goebbels has talked about the U.S. Production Bureau advising horses be unshod at rest to save wear of iron horseshoes. horseshoes with zips recommended. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's just part of the usual ridiculous propaganda.
And as I touched on earlier, it really looks as if 1943 things are beginning to move. Here, various observations about things happening in the UK. Hospitals in the south of England being readied with staff summoned. Somebody comments that things look like business. But the king was in North Africa. This is the English king, presumably.
Yeah.
Had gone out there. So Britain was starting to sort of come out of its shell in quite a big way, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ord's obviously picked this up from the BBC, or somebody's been listening to the BBC and told him that that's it looks like business. They're all hoping that the second front is going to happen and it'll be in France. They're going to be sadly disappointed, but hey, we'll come to that later on. But Ord also talks about, now where he lives at the top of the Rohays, there's a place called Ivygates, and they've seen the Germans had a requisition store near there, and he talks about seeing some Algerians leaving the store there where they've been made to work. And he describes the glum-looking German sentry with tin hair and rifle. It turns out the Algerians saw the sentry and began, to shoot. So I'm presuming that is like making a pistol type thing with their hands, and they were shouting and mocking him. And Ord describes it as performing convulsions and grotesque lewd gestures, whatever those may be. And Ord also notes that passers-by laughed whilst the sentry scowled.
And we also note that there was, because we had lots of French workers over here that were domiciled on the island, in fact, and they're starting to get a little bit cheeky as well.
Yeah, he says, Ord said he met some out on a country road, so quite probably knowing Ord, he was off to go and preach it, not Ebenezer, but one of the other churches, because he did go to St. Sampson's and some of the others because they had to cover for the ministers that had been deported. But he talks about he encountered these French people and they Hitler kaput, and there was a mutual salute and much laughter. And the French said they were expecting fun when the French get going. And
then, as we sort of wrap up this episode, we should remember, of course, that we're 3 years into the war, where the 30th of June 1940 really is when the main German forces commenced arriving. So, Nick, there's obviously some degree of reflection on how the previous 3 years had gone. What was the mood in the islands generally?
Fairly depressed, frankly. All of the diarists are talking about 3 years ago today. The occupation of the islands began when they get to the end of June. And, I mean, the wording is interesting. They talk about things like, they write things like, reason suggests that 3 years hence it will all be over. There's almost a sense of despair in that. But and they talk about the fact that it might have been 3 years, but it feels like the Germans have been here for generations. But they talk about Guernsey folk talking about in what the Germans think is some sort of heavenly daydream, because everyone's talking about what it used to be like before the Germans came, and the Germans just think this is really odd. But they're left with this sort of daydreaming about how good things used to be, and it's quite interesting that they talk about a godlike existence before the deluge, leaving German acquaintances open-mouthed at the contentment and amenities that were here before they came.
Yeah, I mean, many of the Germans, especially the younger ones, had known nothing other than totalitarianism and Hitler. And, of course, the people in the Channel Islands had a free society prior to the war, and the way that our population here in the Channel Islands looked back in the pre-war days would have been completely different to the militaristic conditions in Germany before the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, especially for, of course, many of the older Germans are here would have been better educated, and they'd have been aware of that. It's a very interesting question, that the clash of cultures, because one society had been free and, of course, the other one hadn't.
Yeah, it's very difficult as well, because they can just see some people can just see no end in it and just don't want it over, but they just don't know. They've had their hopes raised at various points. And now again, we're talking about Second Front, etc. Things down, and that buoying the mood somewhat, but it's tempered by the fact that it has been 3 years, and oh my word.
Well, you've got absolutely nothing to look forward to, have you?
No.
Nothing at all. We should remind people there were no radios apart from clandestine ones. So the bulk of the population, it's not just the lack of news, but it's the lack of music. It's the lack of fresh newspapers to read. It's crushing boredom.
And being able to communicate with your loved ones with 20 to 25 words, depending on what point of the occupation you're talking about, and 1 letter a month.
Yep. I mean, we should never forget the deprivations. Okay, so that we're getting towards the end of this June 1943 episode, but we'll catch up on a couple of things. Nick, I know that we have released an episode of your interview at the Imperial War Museum, but I think you were saying to me before we came on air that we'd had a visit from Frank Osier.
Yeah, it was brilliant actually. Frank Osier, who I did an interview with about his experiences of being evacuated and being a boy during the war in England. Frank completely surprised me when I was at the Imperial War Museum recording as part of their podcast live festival, and I just actually finished recording and was just getting myself a cup of coffee, and somebody came along and said, "Oh, there's somebody here to see you," and it turned out to be Frank, and it was brilliant. He came along to have a chat because lives not too far away, and thought he'd pop along. So it was absolutely lovely to have a few words with him. Unfortunately, I got dragged off to go and record something else, so I didn't get to talk to him for too long. But brilliant to see you, Frank. Really, really great that you came along.
Yeah, wonderful. And the reason I wasn't there with Nick is I was in Cambridge a few days later, looking at or through a very, very small part of a newly lodged archive. More on that in future episodes, but as I mentioned to Nick, or explained to Nick before we came on air, some little snippets immediately threw a new light on some aspects of the occupation. So more will be revealed as I know more. I think that pretty much wraps up this episode.
One thing that I mentioned this to you earlier. I obviously interviewed James Bulgin from the Imperial War Museum about various things. One of which was he's got a book coming out about the Nuremberg trials, which is due out it might have been out Friday actually, I think. But he's got a book that he's written about the Nuremberg trial coming out, and we talked briefly about that. And I hadn't realised, if I had, I would have mentioned this at the time. But it's one of those typical things. I found this after I'd come back from interviewing him, and to actually one of the guys who was at the Feldkommandantur here, Herr Friedrich Kraft, ended up as an interpreter and translator at the Nuremberg trial after.
Now he would have had to have undergone a period of denazification himself.
Yep.
So he effectively assisted the Allies in debriefing German prisoners?
I presume so.
Interesting. Very, very interesting.
So I wish I'd known that, because I could have asked James about it. But yeah, no, because of course there's the big thing is the Nuremberg film that's just
yes, of course,
just coming out as well.
Yeah.
I think that's in cinemas as of Monday, as of the date we broadcast this, so on the 17th, I think that is out in cinemas. I believe it's going to be on streaming services in a couple of months' time.
Yeah. Okay, just a reminder that Nick and I will be recording Islands at War on a regular weekly basis for the next 4 or 5 months, Nick, I think.
Yep.
And we're always so grateful to hear from all of you that enjoy the podcast, and you can always connect with us on, what's our email address there, Nick? Is it occupied@gnetradio.com?
That's the one.
That's the one that tripped off my tongue nicely this time. So thank you all for your messages of support, whether it's mentioning it to Nick and I when we meet on the street, or to hear from you in different countries. Always drop us anything that you wish to say about the podcast, because it's truly valuable to us, and we thank you. for your ongoing support. And I think with that, Nick, we'll probably say goodbye.
I was just going to say, and of course, if you've got a story to tell about your family, we would love to talk to you. And distance is no barrier. We can record remotely. So I've recorded an interview with somebody in Australia.
Yep.
It's absolutely no barrier. So please do get in touch if you want to talk about your family and their experiences during the occupation. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, so I think we'll play out with a little bit of Jim Delridge. And thank you very much. We'll see you, we can say, next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb.